Good afternoon and welcome to today's discussion on the preliminary root cause analysis of the August 2020 heat wave and energy events. My name is Isabella Nicosia with ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating today's web conference. I'm also joined on the line today by Pete Scala, Director of Efficiency, Electrification, and Procurement at the California Public Utilities Commission Energy Division, and Siva Gunda, Deputy Director of the Energy Assessments Division at the California Energy Commission, as well as the following ISO representatives: Delphine Ho, Director, California Regulatory Affairs; Mark Rossleader, Vice President, Market Policy and Performance; Guillermo Bautista Alderte, Director, Market Analysis and Forecasting; Joanne Serena, Executive Director, Customer Service and Stakeholder Affairs; Keone Almeida, Manager, Stakeholder Affairs; Anna McKenna, Assistant General Counsel; and Vonette Fontaine, Senior Public Information Officer, Communications and Public Relations. The presentation for today's call is available on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage of the California ISO website, and today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The video recording will also be available on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage in the coming days. We're going to start today's call off with a joint presentation by the ISO, CPUC, and CEC. Following that presentation, we will be responding to questions that were submitted in advance of today's call to ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. That mailbox will remain open for stakeholders to submit questions during and after today's call. We will answer clarifying questions first and then respond to others as time permits. We will not be taking verbal or chat questions during today's call. Now I'd like to turn it over to Pete Scala to kick off the presentation on the preliminary root cause analysis.
Thank you, Isabella. Next slide. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. The CEC, PUC, and CAISO co-authored the outage report since each play a role in maintaining reliability, and this slide describes these roles, which many of you are likely quite familiar. The CEC prepares and adopts the hourly long-term electricity demand forecast to be used in a variety of planning efforts, including resource adequacy. The CPUC sets reliability requirements for the investor-owned utilities, community choice aggregators, and energy service providers that participate in the CAISO market to ensure that there is sufficient capacity to meet forecasted demand. And CAISO operates the transmission system and wholesale energy markets to maintain grid reliability. Next slide, please. So the preliminary report finds that there were three overarching root causes of the rotating outages and stress grid conditions during the August heat storm. We will expand on these in the following few slides, but in summary, first, the current reliability planning process is not designed to address a 1 in 35-year heat event. Second, planning targets in the transition to a reliable, clean, and affordable energy resource mix have not added sufficient resources to meet demand in the early evening hours of extremely hot days. And third, several practices in the energy markets exacerbated these supply challenges under highly stressed conditions.
Hi, Pete. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. If you get closer to the microphone, please.
Okay. Is this better?
That's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay. Should I redo that one? Everyone?
I would. It's a little bit hard to hear you.
Okay. I'm basically reading off the slide, folks. The preliminary report finds that there were three overarching root causes of the rotating outages and stressed grid conditions during the heat storm. And we will expand on these in the following few slides. But to summarize, the first root cause was the current reliability planning process is not designed to address a 1 in 35-year event. Second, planning targets in this transition to a reliable, clean, and affordable energy resource mix have not added sufficient resources to meet demand in the early evening hours of extremely hot days. And third, several practices in the energy markets exacerbated these supply challenges under highly stressed conditions. The report identifies several other discrete contributing factors, but these were the three primary causes identified. And with that, I will turn it over to Siva Gunda to expand on this first root cause.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you for advancing the slide, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group, and look forward to answering any questions you might have. So I'm going to just expand a little bit on the first root cause that Pete kind of mentioned, which is that the existing resource planning processes are not designed to fully address extreme heat storm. And I think it's good to just kind of set the stage on the heat that we've experienced. What an extraordinary event that was in August. As you see from this slide, you have 35 years worth of weather data on the slide starting back from 1985. And the line that's highlighted in orange is the 2020, and the line in blue is the 2015, which was the previous high heat year that we've had on record. As you see, the 2020 event, a couple of noteworthy points. One is it's a 1 in 30, 35 event, meaning it hasn't happened in 35 years, that kind of heat. Two, we've experienced 4 of the 5 hottest August days since 1985. August 14th was the 3rd hottest August day, and August 15th was the hottest on record. If you look at the percentile side, these are 6 straight days of exceeding the 95th percentile. On the top of having extreme heat in California for successive days, which kind of builds the heat over days and hence the air conditioning load, it was also really hot across the Northwest. We've experienced a sustained, high heat of 90 and above in Portland during the time, as well as 80s to up to a 97 on the 16th in Seattle. So it's overall, it was a pretty intense heat storm. And so to just kind of point then to how this translates into the forecasting process, CEC develops a variety of forecasts, as Pete previously mentioned. We do develop as a part of the forecast a 1 in 2, a 1 in 5, 1 in 10, and a 1 in 20 annual peak, but specifically for the resource adequacy process, 1 in 2 peak forecast is used with a little bit of a buffer, and the 15% PRM, a part of the 15% PRM actually goes towards the deviation from the forecast. So just to kind of note that, this is an extreme event. We don't necessarily plan for this level of extreme heat events, and moving forward, this could be the new normal, and there's an opportunity to look into that. With that, I'll pass it on to Delphine.
Great. Thank you very much, Siva. This is Delphine here from the California ISO. This slide will be fairly familiar to those of you who spend a lot of time in the CAISO markets, but I'll go through it a little bit and add a little bit color about what happened on August 14th and 15th. So the punchline here is, through the preliminary root cause analysis, one of the things that we really wanted to dig into was, re-looking at the planning targets that we have and really trying to see how that matches up with a grid that's evolving very quickly with resources that are very different from when the planning targets were originally established, and really looking at new needs on the system. And sort of the one that really was pivotal during the event was this early evening hours, which I think for those of you in the CAISO forums have heard us speak about, the need to ramp as the sun sets. So going back on this day, if you look at the blue lines, that is the total load, and you can see there the peaks of each day was around 5 p.m. And fairly high on the 14th at 46,802, and a little bit lower on that Saturday, the 15th. But both of these are noteworthy because that is what the planning targets have traditionally been targeting, are those sort of, very early evening, late afternoon, early evening, 5 p.m. peaks. But what's a newer phenomenon is the net demand line that is right below that in orange. For those of you that are familiar with our processes, we spend a lot of time talking about the net demand, which is really if you take out the wind and solar generation that's used to serve the load in the blue demand, what happens is the orange line that's left over is the amount of load that needs to be served with all of the other resources on the system, net of wind and solar. And you can see that when you take that away, the time shifts quite a bit to, closer to, between 6 and 7. So that really, especially on the 14th with, the high load, that pushes the hour need out quite a bit to closer to 7 p.m. And even though the number there, you know, the 42,000 obviously is quite a bit lower than the 46,008, there's actually two interactions happening here that really makes the net demand quite a double whammy. And that's, first of all, what's occurring here is that obviously the grid-connected solar is declining, but the second one is that the behind-the-meter load that, the load that was served by behind-the-meter solar is now coming back onto the grid. So you do have these forces at play where you actually have the load increasing faster than you have the generation side falling off. That was a little bit the other way around on the 15th. It was less pronounced on the 15th, but the 15th then had some other issues where you can see that the net demand line is actually a bit more volatile. So slightly different conditions between the 14th and 15th. On the 14th, we had a lot of robust wind and solar, but again, the net demand still suffered from that kind of double whammy of having the load come back on fairly aggressively, and again, very hot days, so we had still a lot of air conditioning pull later in the day as the solar was coming off. On the 15th, again, still very hot, still very high air conditioning pulls, but there we had a lot of volatility with the wind and solar fleet, even though, you know, the absolute numbers were slightly lower. And you can see from the background on the vertical gray lines, both of our stage 3 emergencies occurred right, coincident with the net demand peaks. So that really speaks to how sensitive those periods are. I do want to emphasize that, for folks who have been paying attention to, CAISO resources on a day-to-day basis, oftentimes what happens is, as the solar is coming off, the resources that are increasing to serve that demand typically are the internal natural gas and the imports, which in itself could be a blend of, imported gas, imported hydro, other resources. But as Siva had mentioned, this heat wave was west-wide, so that really impacted our ability to get a lot of imports that were freely available. We did get some, which we'll, talk about sort of later in the presentation as well as through the Q&A, but it was not as flush as we typically have seen on sort of the day-to-day. But through this, I want to note that the underlying point here is not to point at renewables, but really is to point at planning. How the renewables behave is obviously a known factor. The sun rises, the sun sets. We all know that very well. But it is just a matter of refocusing our efforts away from potentially the peak hour and looking at other hours of needs, including these early evening net demand hours. And in fact, that has been happening over the last couple of years. For example, the CPUC has been reducing the effective load carrying capability of intermittent resources. So in other words, the resource adequacy value of those resources has been declining to reflect this phenomenon that, the fact that there is a greater need later in the day when there's somewhat less of those resources. And in fact, the reduction there has been up to even 80% of the RA value. But apparently more work needs to be done. And apparently, the planning targets that we are evolving really haven't kept pace with just how fast the system has moved forward. So I think that's where we want to underscore in terms of our planning targets, not keeping pace. We understand, some of the issues are, and it's just a matter of being able to move that forward so it connects with where the system actually is. And as Siva mentioned, this isn't just a one-off. Obviously, the mid-August events was very extreme. Hopefully we're not going to see 1 in 35 days every year, but to the extent that we're going to probably experience more volatile summers or maybe even more volatile shoulder months or winters, that is something we should consider and plan for in trying to understand what those volatilities are. Sorry, I think there might be some background noise. But that was very enjoyable. Thank you for the interlude.
Yes, just a reminder, if you're not speaking, please make sure your line is muted.
Okay, and with that, I can move on to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So in this one, this is going into the third issue that was uncovered in the preliminary root cause and that were some of the practices in the day-ahead energy market tended to exacerbate the already challenging and stress conditions that we were experiencing on that day. So here we have a graph that is showing the actual demand. That's the 1-minute actual demand that we pulled from our system, and we overlaid on top of that the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand, as well as the day-ahead bid-in demand. For this preliminary analysis, we're still, I'll just note that we're still doing a lot of work in trying to understand some of the data that we have. I think even after the report, the preliminary report went out, we've identified, several refinements that we can make, one of which is the actual demand and the CAISO forecast demand is being viewed from the transmission side. The day-ahead bid-in demand is viewed from sort of, the load side up. And so one of the first things that we identified, unfortunately after the report came out, but one of the things that we did identify is that there's a loss component that is not captured here in the graphic and obviously in the report. So as we move into the final, those are the things that we'll try to refine. At this stage, what we've identified is that it'll move the lines a little bit closer together by maybe as much as 600 megawatts, but it won't close that gap entirely. So if you can look at the numbers below in the table, about 3,000 or so, again, it'll close a little bit, it'll reduce, but it won't entirely close that gap. But what we wanted to emphasize is that the underscheduling, and we have some good questions in the list of questions that we received, so we can dig into that a little bit later. But we do want to note that we're still need to look into a little bit more of why this potentially happened, whether there was a strategy for this or there was some under accounting, and try to understand what that looks like. But the impact, which is what we want to focus on, at least for the preliminary report, the impact of this is that, unfortunately, with the lower amount of bid and demand, it did, unfortunately, not quite set our market up right in the beginning. And then as we move forward in the day-ahead processes, we found that there were other issues, mainly within the residual unit commitment, that didn't catch this. And weren't able to turn things around in the day ahead. So let me start a little bit back with how some of the mechanisms work together. So if you look at the bid and demand, obviously that's a bit lower than the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand. Within the day-ahead process, after the integrated forward market, we do have the residual unit commitment process. And that's a reliability check that the CAISO has. So instead of using the day-ahead bid and demand, the CAISO then uses its own forecast of CAISO load. And you can see that's a bit higher. It tracks a little bit better with the actual demand. Though, again, the actual demand, will note that it already includes the impact of demand response. So that actual demand was even higher without the demand response embedded into it. So what RUC is trying to do is trying to use instead the CAISO forecast of CAISO load, trying to close that gap between maybe the lower under-scheduled bid and demand and the higher CAISO forecast. And it'll do that by scheduling and looking at the bids for supply and demand, and it'll take out convergence bids. But, what we eventually found was that RUC really was not capturing that. And during the event, it was kind of difficult to see what all the overlaying mechanisms were and how they interacted. So one of the first things that we did during the event, and as we announced through our market notice, is that we ended up suspending convergence bidding. And that was largely to be able to at least kind of hold one variable constant to see really what, kind of look under the hood and see what was going on. So when we were able to suspend convergence bidding after looking at the day-ahead market outputs for August 16th, I believe it was, that's when we were able to kind of isolate the fact that, RUC really wasn't necessarily doing what we hoped it would do. And even after the mid-August event, Guillermo and his team continued to dig into and look into why that happened. And there what was identified was that a change that we implemented in 2014, which obviously was an improvement at that time, was pointing RUC to a process where between the scheduling run and the pricing run, it was pointing to I believe, the pricing run, and unfortunately was only taking in the prices that was coming out of the RUC, but not really recognizing that the scheduling run really had the better outcome in terms of being able to understand that load under scheduling. So I think after the fact, we were able to dig into that, and as Guillermo had gone over in the public forums prior to this, it was identified in a BPM change on September 5th to redirect the residual unit commitment process to use the scheduling run. And the scheduling run would then be able to identify the fact that there was this low amount of bid and demand, or the underscheduling. It would be able to identify and sort of clear out the impacts of convergence bidding, for example, and really allow RUC to be able to run the reliability process it was intended to do. So all of that was, that change was made after the fact, and that change doesn't affect any other processes, just specifically the RUC. Lastly, we'll note that the real-time bid priority was using the IFM instead of RUC, and now we do point at the RUC. So all of that is aligned at this point. So those are the major issues that we identified thus far. But again, a lot of that is a day-ahead story. So in the day-ahead, obviously, we were not set up correctly, the 14th and 15th. But what happened in the real-time then is then the real-time market had to work twice as hard to try to kind of untangle what was set up in the day-ahead. So one thing we do want to note is that I think there, and later on we'll go through some of the questions, there are some questions of, well, if, CAISO's fixed this, then is there anything else to do? We still think there's a value in looking into why there was underscheduling and trying to reach out to folks and understand the underlying drivers. But again, that also meant that if the day-ahead is not set up right, our real-time market worked kind of twice as hard to bring things, and loop it back around. So the examples there are the real-time market then had to attract more imports, because once you remove the convergence bid, you have to look at what you physically have, and what we physically have was potentially not enough to serve the internal load. And so the real-time market did attract more imports into the market, as well as we did get voluntary transfers from the energy imbalance market. And then lastly, our operators were able to secure some emergency transfers from neighboring balancing authorities. So, the three of those combined, again, all real-time actions that had to work, twice as hard to kind of untangle some of the things that were not quite set up right in the day-ahead market. So those are the market practices that we've identified that really was not helpful, unfortunately, and was really uncovered because we had these fairly stressed conditions. Okay, with that, we can turn to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Siva, please.
Yeah, thank you, Delphine. So just before I jump into this slide, there have been at least a question. I'm just tracking some of the chat, specifically about the demand that we observed in August this year versus 2006, and I think it's a really good observation in the sense that it's 2006 was a higher peak number. I just want to make sure that we recognize that in 2006, there hasn't been a lot of behind-the-meter solar, and now we have almost 8,600 megawatts in CAISO territory. So the peak that we've observed in September, if we want to, in August, sorry, if we want to compare 2020 to 2006 as an apples to apples, we really have to add the behind-the-meter solar generation, which could have been up in the upward of 6,000 to 7,000 megawatts on the top of the peak that we've seen. So just want to make sure I have a chance to point that. So going into this particular slide, this covers both the near-term actions and recommendations that the joint organizations have to ensure summer 2021 reliability, but also some of the actions that have been already taken. So the first of which is to make sure there is actually enough generation. So just to level set, if we take the 2020 RA planning and then 2021 RA planning, And the observed difference, if we are taking the 1 in 2 plus a 15% PRM, is roughly 300 megawatts. So if we're planning, we do not have an extreme heat weather in 2021. We are set up to plan for similar to 2020 conditions. But taking into account that the event that we've seen in 2020, August, could be the new norm, an important point of it is to ensure that there is new generations coming online. And under the leadership of CPUC, there is a bunch of generation still in the ground that is expected to come online by August 2021, and more around those lines could be discussed in the Q&A. There's also a second bucket, which is just to think about the resource planning and procurement process as a whole. As Delphine and Pete both observed, if we continue to plan for a 1 in 2 and 15% margin and these 1 in 35 or more extreme events, for example, we haven't really discussed the Labor Day or September. The September heat storm was in the vicinity of 1 in 68. So if we're talking about beginning to plan for extreme events like this, it becomes imperative that we take a hard look at how we plan and then make the necessary changes moving forward. As Delphine discussed, there have been some market enhancements already done, and they're going to continue to look into it. And finally, an important bucket of work that we've identified is to really improving situational awareness and planning for contingencies. As a part of that, CEC plays an important role in making sure we develop the necessary analytical assessments for planning purposes that other sister agencies as well as entities like CAISO could use. So as a part of that, we're going to start looking at the statewide and WEC-wide resource sufficiency assessments to really develop a situational awareness. And two, as we all recognized during August, we could collectively have done better in terms of communication. So there is going to be a strong focus on developing the necessary communication protocols to trigger a statewide coordination. While the focus of the report has been the 14th and 15th, the heat storm and the demand that was predicted for 17th, 18th, and 19th was much more stressed. And if not for the statewide coordination that has occurred under the leadership of the governor's office, we could have had more outages. So we really have to develop the necessary communication protocols to trigger statewide coordination. And finally, we have learned from those 17th, 18th, and 19th days that we could take a number of actions to plan for contingencies in case we see these shortfalls. And from those lessons learned, we are hoping to develop a contingency plan that really systematizes the actions that we've taken in a way those actions are equitable and optimized between reliability and emissions. With that, next slide, please. So this slide builds on the previous one, but goes into more of the midterm to long-term considerations and recommendations we collectively have identified. Again, this falls into broadly three buckets. So one is three categories. So one is the resource planning and development, market enhancements, and a group of actions aimed at improving situational awareness and planning for contingencies. Within the resource planning category, the three entities will consider whether and how much of new resources are needed, taking into account the changes in the supply stack that is expected to occur through this transitional period. I think we all recognize that we are in an inflection point of transition, and as the state plans towards the clean, reliable, and affordable grid, how do we plan for transition and ensure that there is sufficiency in the supply stack? We will have special focus on accelerating the demand-side opportunities as more and more end users are expected to be electrified, both in the near and the long term. An important part of the resource planning moving forward would be to really harmonize the different planning horizons that we work within today. For example, we have year-ahead planning horizon for resource adequacy purposes. We have the 10-year planning horizon for transmission planning, and the 25-year-ahead horizon for SB 100 planning. So as we harmonize these efforts, we will use the SB 100 interagency forum and the process to really consider where diverse resources can be built, taking into account land use and equity considerations. We will also be launching the transmission working group to evaluate transmission options and constraints to really synergize and there isn't gaps between these three planning horizons. And finally, the three agencies identify the need to develop additional analytical assessments to be taken up under CEC IPER process to support planning activities at sister agencies. Some of the key topics include statewide and west-wide RA assessments to underscore the need for awareness of supply conditions across the West moving forward, and also update the range of climate scenarios in the CEC's forecasting. We do consider a number of climate scenarios, but what this has really opened up is looking at not just the temperature and humidity conditions, which we currently pretty well bake into our forecast, but also the effect of smoke, the effect of soot and ash, and so on. And all those things have to be considered moving forward. And as I noted earlier, we really need to figure out how to bridge gaps between the planning considerations across the various planning horizons. So with that, I will pass it back to Delphine.
Great, thank you. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is the last slide of the presentation. So here are a few next steps at minimum that we've identified that we should include in the final analysis, though part of the effort today in receiving the questions from stakeholders is to see if there are additional items that we can consider for inclusion. But at minimum, the main topics that we're looking at that we either didn't have time to address or didn't have the data or capability to address in the preliminary report is a short list here in front of you. We'll go into this a little bit. There's some questions about accredited resources. So there are questions about, how did those resources, because they're not shown on the RA supply plans, how did they perform across both PUC and non-CPUC jurisdictional footprints? Related to that are demand response. We don't get settlement data, meter data, until, for those of you familiar with CAISO terms, T+55. Those are business days, so it won't be. We won't receive those until early November. So again, nothing in the report points to actual demand response performance based on settlement quality meter data that the CAISO has received. So for the reliability demand response, we did get estimates from the investor-owned utilities, and so we thank them for quickly putting that together. But all the other demand response information that is in the report is not actual response. It is just the CAISO dispatch that went out, and so we don't yet have the response data there. We do also want to analyze how different load surging, as I mentioned before, how different scheduling coordinators for load, scheduled load into the day-ahead market. And again, yes, RUC can do a good job in trying to, close that gap, but I think we still want to try to understand the underlying drivers for why it happened and whether it was sort of a forecast improvement that's needed, or there was something else there. The next one is again, as Siva mentioned, I think there's quite a list of communications improvements, and for this one in particular, this is more directed at the utility distribution companies to make sure that there is good tight communication between the CAISO and the UDCs when it comes time to respond to events and making sure that we're kind of leaving no stone unturned in that effort. And lastly, again, we haven't identified anything, but there's always the option to review the performance of specific resources during the heat storm and potentially other items that we can consider, either derivative of the questions that we're getting from stakeholders or other things we might uncover as we continue to dig into the data and do our analysis. So one thing I wanted to note before we move on to, we've got quite a robust list of questions, so we thank you all for being proactive and submitting that to us. That's always extremely helpful because it helps us kind of prepare the responses more fully. But please do continue submitting questions into the email box that Isabella provided at the beginning. We'll provide it again at the end and throughout this call. One thing we'll note that, as I mentioned before, after we finished the report, we did identify at minimum a few refinements, but also, unfortunately, we did catch, after the fact, a few errata, so I wanted to call those out, and those impact some of the questions that we have received as well. The first one is going to impact figures in the executive summary, ES.3, as well as its sort of companion series of graphics in the appendix, and that's going to be figures B.16 through B.19. And what the change there is, some of you have noted that it looks a bit odd that the yellow bars seem pretty high for the real-time, and why would the yellow bar for the real-time awards be any higher than actual energy provided? And you guys are all very keen, eagle eyes to have spotted that, and that is because there was a formula error, unfortunately, and the spreadsheets were pointing to the IFM data. So if you look at the IFM graphs, you'll see that the yellow bars are exactly the same because it is the IFM information, and we'll provide an errata and update those graphics so that you'll see that oftentimes the green dot is actually exactly where, or very close to where those yellow bars are. So again, apologies for that confusion. I think a bunch of folks did point that out, so you guys are correct. It did look very odd, and that was not captured before it went out. We also do have a change in labeling, figure B.24. We had been using the terminology above RA, and that one was using non-RA, and we need to clarify that is above RA for wind and solar, but not for the other resources, as Guillermo had previously clarified at the MSC meeting for those who had been listening in on that call. So that will be another change that we'll make to make sure that the labeling as well as the description above that graphic is more clear, and that is kind of more in line with the rest of the report anyhow. And as I mentioned, refinements to what we already done, the one thing we have identified is to include the loss factor on the underscheduling. So we're collecting a short list of that. We'll discuss internally how we release that, and we're thinking likely we'll probably release it sooner rather than later and not have to wait for the final report. But we will likely send out an announcement about those errata, which we will be addressing. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Isabella, who is our keeper of questions, and start going through the good list of questions we got.
Thanks, Delphine. Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we will first address clarifying questions and then move into other questions, at time permitting. So I am going to start off with a question on the report. In figures such as B16, what is reflected in the actual energy dots? Do the dots only reflect the provision of energy and not AS? Could the provision of AS account for a portion of the difference between green dots and the corresponding gold bars?
Yes. I can start, and Guillermo and others, if you want to chime in, please feel free to do so. So yes, the actual green dots, the energy dots, only reflect provision of energy, and we did that on purpose because between the AS awards and energy, there is some amount of overlap. So what you have in the gold bars, or the yellow gold bars in the background, are the separate awards for energy and AS. So I'm sorry, there was a yes, so that is the correct interpretation.
Okay, so the second question would be, could the CAISO disaggregate the gold bars to show AS provision by resource type, and that's as well as on figures such as B16?
Okay, yeah, we can take that under advisement and see if we can try to do that. It's always a struggle when you got that many data points not to make a graph that just makes everyone's eyes water, but we'll take that under advisement. Thank you.
Next question, why does actual energy appear to diverge significantly from real-time energy and AS awards for solar? Do real-time solar forecasts flash schedules routinely underestimate actual energy, particularly under stress conditions during net load peak hours, such as those experienced on the 14th and 15th?
Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. So that question came up pretty early. Yes. So that was the error that we're talking about. So thank you for identifying that. I think when we do the recalculation and refresh the tables, you'll see that the green dots and the gold bars in the real time are going to come out a lot closer, if not exactly the same.
Okay, next question. The preliminary report shows that bid-in demand on August 14th and 15th was well below both actual demand and the CAISO's forecast demand. They're referring to page 97 and up. Has the CAISO considered if this pattern may suggest systematic error in scheduling coordinators behind the meter solar forecast? If so, does the CAISO have recommendations to ameliorate the forecast error?
I don't know if Guillermo wanted to take that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think right now it's a bit premature to draw conclusions of what the drivers could be. And we're still collecting and analyzing data for understanding better the underscheduling. So I would prefer that we hold until we have all the pieces completed of the analysis so that we can concisely and factual-based identify what the causes are. There may be many factors. One could be potentially any conditions driven by the weather that could indirectly affect, such as behind the meter, because behind the meter is also impacted by weather conditions. But I would suggest that we have just to go through the analysis and understand better what really happened, and then we can really identify the causes.
Okay, thanks, Guillermo. Why was curtailing of exports not considered on August 14th and 15th, similar to how they were curtailed the following week? Guillermo or Delphine, would you like to address that one?
Okay, I can try to answer this one. I think we need to put in perspective how the timing of this happened. Obviously, during the 14 and 15, as we have explained in the report, there were several issues masking the root causes that had to be analyzed first to be able to understand what was happening, what the drivers were. We started taking action as we unraveled these drivers, such as the interplay of counter-scheduling. Later on, we realized the implications of the rock enhancements that we have done a few years back. So as we progress through the analysis and understanding of the conditions, that is when we start taking action. So obviously, by the time we were already leaving August 14, the day-ahead market was already run one day before, on August 13. There is always this natural lag that pertains to the day-ahead market of how soon changes can come in effect, given the fact that it's always running one day in advance. So we have first to analyze what happened on a given day that is already operating, such as August 14 and 15, then understand what happens, and then look at what is our next opportunity to effectuate any changes. That is really how the change starts to happen until we have the opportunity to first understand the dynamics.
So another question for maybe either Guillermo or Delphine. Were CPM solicitations or offers made in July or August prior to the blackout? The report states that no resources accepted such an offer because of prior contracting commitments to other BAs, but then states that CPM authorization did start on August 16th. What changed such that offers were now accepted on the 16th?
Sure, this is Delphine. I can start that one, and Guillermo, please jump in and add. So we do have our typical competitive solicitation process. People can make sort of intro monthly offers, but I think we were under such extraordinary conditions that we did reach out and make additional calls for CPM. I believe there was a market notice that went out that provided our intent to designate CPM pursuant to a significant event. So really, I think here it was sort of we're trying to go above and beyond what was there. And I think the sequence of events was, I think the first tranche of resources that we reached out to were available to provide energy for the very short term, but they did have contracts with other systems, and so they couldn't commit to the 30-day CPM. And again, the CPM is voluntary, so they couldn't commit to that, so they declined the capacity payment offer. So really, it wasn't until the 16th. So we were trying before then, but, you know, it wasn't until the 16th that we were able to find resources successfully that was willing to accept the CPM payment with the 30 days. And remember, the way we have it is if you accept the CPM payment for 30 days, you know, we could extend it after that. So I think, you know, there were resources that really had to consider, you know, where they were in their contracting, whether they had obligations to other systems. So again, from what we understand is that they were happy to provide energy on a short-term basis. So, you know, everyone wanted to help each other on that day, but it was just the extra step of could they commit to an actual CPM, you know, 30-day and potentially even more than that obligation.
Okay, thanks, Delphine. These next couple of questions will probably be geared towards Mark and Delphine. So I'll start with the report notes that 51,413 megawatts of RA capacity was shown to the CAISO to meet the 51,413 megawatt RA requirement. However, the report also noted an approximately 500 megawatt resource was on planned outage and not substituted. This would suggest that the CAISO did not have sufficient resources. Why was this outage not substituted, and why did the CAISO not cancel the outage?
I can start this one, and other folks can feel free to jump in. So a friendly amendment on that one. It was I think lower, a little bit lower than that. And there was one resource on the gas side that was a bit larger. I think it was just maybe under 400 megawatts. And there, from what we understand, is that, you know, it's a little bit tricky because this was a resource that actually had their planned outage back in June. But and there, I didn't think we were. It sounded like we were under different circumstances than obviously August or, you know, the middle of August. But as that planned outage kind of progressed, it got extended into the peak summer months, and eventually, you know, at that point, the more it got extended, it was, you know, more or less a forced outage. But I think the lesson learned there is that's correct. It was not substituted. It was not replaced. And that was definitely one of the lessons that we learned from the root cause analysis. And so that's certainly something that the CAISO will be taking a hard look at and looking at, you know, what can we do either in the near term or obviously in the longer term to see how we can make sure that we are able to replace that planned outage, to have the substitution ready. And so, you know, one potential vehicle is, you know, we do have a stakeholder process called RA enhancements. So I think there the issue had already been raised, so we can, you know, bring it back up there or potentially another forum. But I think, you know, that is a lesson that came out of the root cause analysis that we will be acting upon.
Thanks, Delphine. Another question maybe for Mark or for you as well. Please provide a definition for under-scheduling and how it is different from under-forecasting of bid and demand.
Maybe I'll lean on Mark for this one.
Sure. So I think we looked at both the amount of bid-in load as well as scheduled load. And if we look at it either way, and we should be clear that most of the bid-in load actually did clear at near the top of its bid. So what we're looking at there is what ultimately cleared, which and we see that amount of cleared load, which is made up of the economic cleared load as well as the self-scheduled load, was less than the actual or forecast load. If we had seen that a lot of the bid-in load did not clear, then it would be more a question, okay, how do we get the bid-in load to bid such that it does clear? But that's not the dominant thing that we're seeing. We're seeing that the amount of the bid-in load plus the scheduled load is still below the amount of the forecast and actual load.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Another one probably good for either Mark or Delphine. The report noted a 1 in 35 year weather event. However, the current planning standards are 1- and 2-year demand with a 15% planning reserve margin. Was this an issue that of the 1- and 2-year lagging behind climate change, or the current planning reserve margin is not sufficient any longer?
I can start this one. So, yeah, I think that's something that we want to dig into because both could be true, and I think we probably need to do some more analysis. You know, one thing that we've observed, and this is something that CAISO has pointed out, is we certainly are concerned about the shoulder months, and surprised we're in October with a flex alert. And that is because when you're looking at the confluence of issues, we're coming off the summer months. We obviously the weather is transitioning, so it could be hot, it could be cold, but we do have a large amount of the fleet on planned maintenance after the summertime. And again, increasingly so, we do have wildfire concerns in the state. So again, you know, I think even today is a really good example where folks are, and we're hearing kind of across the media, there's you know, some confusion, a lot of concerns. We're hearing a PSPS, but a flex alert at the same time, and we've gotten questions of, well, how can this be? It's October, and unfortunately, this is sort of exactly the scenario where I think folks in the industry kind of know this is maintenance period, so you don't have the full fleet you had even in August, but then it could still be, you know, fairly warm. And we would, you know, still need generation for that. So yeah, so I think climate change can exacerbate that. So maybe there probably is a lagging behind on the 1 and 2 side. I think it's also interesting on the planning reserve side. I think one thing from the CAISO perspective is, you know, we are certainly interested in trying to understand, you know, what does this actually look like from a loss of load expectation perspective. So does a 15% planning reserve margin actually equate the 1 in 10 LOLE? And we understand that, you know, some work has already been done to that effect within IRP. And so I think all of those are areas that we'd like to explore and, you know, work together with PUC and CEC on to kind of dig into those, because there isn't going to be a silver bullet that kind of fixes everything. And I know there are concerns about balancing, you know, do we cover for every single, you know, edge contingency? Oh, we can't do that, but what's a reasonable amount of coverage that we should have for the footprint? I don't know. I wanted to maybe open it up if there's any comments from either, you know, PUC or CEC on that issue.
This is Pete from the PUC, and yeah, I think that's Delphine, you characterized it pretty well. You could, again, as the report indicates, the real focus here is on what's going on at net peak and what resources are needed to shore up. I mean, if you look at solar throughout that hour and its production in the first half of the hour well above NQC and then well below in the second half, there's a lot of change happening in that hour, and we certainly need to get resources online that can support that. And whether that's, whether that's truly just that the 1 and 2 is lagging behind climate change, or that whether you want to focus on the planning reserve margin, it's almost two sides of the same coin. But I think the takeaway here is we need more resources because of climate change, and we need particularly resources that can support that net demand transition.
Yeah, Delphine, thanks for asking. I think you both characterized it really well, and I don't think I had anything more to add than just kind of noting that the 1 in 5, if we would have planned for 1 in 5, we would have planned for 47,000 peak plus PRM, and I think really the event we've seen is, it depends on how we plan for. Are we planning for exactly the demand? How much deviation are we planning for? So it depends on, depending on the analysis, you could go and you cite, as Pete said, it's two sides of the same coin, and collectively we have to figure out the best way to characterize this, taking into account reliability and affordability together.
Okay. Moving towards another question that may be more geared for the CEC. Based on CEC analysis, the heat storm experienced in August was a 1 in 35-year weather event. Can the CEC or CAISO explain what weather basis this was determined for? Was this with regard to CAISO temperatures only, California temperatures only, or a combination of some or all states within WEC? What temporal period was the 1 in 35?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this question. Thank you. So just kind of going through, so it's a 35-year composite that we've done. So it's across California, not WEC. So it's California's temperature across a variety of sites that we take from, and then we weight them to develop a statewide composite. So those are statewide numbers. So as I said, you could, when you look at the weather data, and you could look at statistically, you could look at it in many ways. You could look at just the day, you could just look at the week, you could look at the month, you could look at it on a historical basis or some sort of a underlying climate trend that you're observing. So we've done a bunch of different statistics that we will include in the final report. But at a very high level, if you're looking at a historical trend, it's close to a 1 in 30, 35 event is what we're looking at. September, similarly, is 1 in 68. And October was about 1 in 17. And just want to give a high level on what the statistics mean. And these estimates represent the probabilities of experiencing a month with the composite temperatures as high or higher than on the hottest day in the month of 2020. The temperature metric we went with is the average of daily high and daily low. The reason we went with the average is while we had very hot days, the real problem here was it was not cooling off in the evening. And so you really had to look at an average to understand how it was moving. And the historical values less likely show these events are less precedented, but possible from historical standpoint. And the trended values show these events are becoming more common because as we look at we also looked at these events from a climate trend perspective. So as we are observing that and we're developing that analysis right now, it is looking like it's becoming more common. And then just want to note what these statistics do not mean, and then some caveats here. We did not attempt yet to assess consecutive days of high heat, like 6 days in August, which we would expect to be much, much less likely than these metrics. So once we look at it as cumulative days, it could actually be a much extreme weather event. And the trend is, so some of the trends that we're observing on the historical side, on the climate side, we're still figuring it out and it's rudimentary. So we will figure it out a little bit more and then bring it into the final report as we are comfortable. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Moving back towards a question that may be geared more to our ISO folks. Does the CAISO suggest that planning standards should cover a 1 in 35 weather event? What would the planning reserve margin be in such a case?
Yeah, I think it's probably premature to determine that right now. So like I said, we really do want to spend a little more time digging into it. And I appreciate what Pete brought up, which is, I think before, well, maybe not before, but in addition to just looking at the peak, we do want to concentrate on the net demand hours that traditionally hasn't been the focus. So I think part of this effort is to understand that there needs to be a little bit of refocusing. We need more resources, and there's sort of a variety of things that are going on here, and it's not necessarily just flipping over to a planning reserve margin that covers a 1 in 35, because even if you did do that, the current metric is still based on peak, and again, the concern at this point is now demand peak. And I keep saying this point because, as the grid evolves, who knows what, sort of a different time scale might occur in a couple of years that will be sort of the new critical grid need hour. But at least for now, and at least for the last couple of years, it has been fairly consistently around the net demand hours, that sort of 4 to 9 p.m. time frame. There's a lot of things trying to help address that problem. For example, time of use rates, kind of aligning with that time period is also extremely helpful. And to the extent consumers can see pricing to align with those times, that's very helpful. So I wouldn't say that we're automatically jumping to a PRM that covers a 1 in 35, but I think as both Pete and Siva mentioned, we do want to understand how that volatility that's increasing is impacting our planning standards. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Delphine. And I have another one that's probably geared towards you. So in the report, it states, at 6:38 p.m., the CAISO declared a Stage 3 emergency because it was deficient in meeting its reserve requirement. This is on page 35. Can the CAISO provide the level of operating reserves when the decision was made to shed firm load? Did the CAISO experience operating reserve levels below that level at other times? And if so, what factors obviated the need for outages at those times?
Sure, I'll start on this one. So I don't have the specific operating reserve percentage on hand, but it did fall below 6%, which is what triggered us to call for the controlled load shed. I'll note that going back into the report, what could help folks understand the situation or the background to this better is if they go to page 30, we try to put in there some background in terms of some background in terms of how our operating reserves are established, going back to the NERC and WEC standards, but really what that means for us in the operational space. And the things to focus on is that there are two parts to the operating reserves. There's the spinning and non-spinning reserves. The spinning reserves are the generating resources that are actually running or quote-unquote spinning, and those are important because they very quickly and automatically provide energy in case there is a contingency on the system. The non-spinning reserves, they're resources that can respond within 10 minutes, so they may be entirely off. They're not running. And so, if a contingency were to occur, it would be another 10 minutes before any of those resources can respond. So the linkage to the 14th and the 15th is that under really extraordinary circumstances, it's possible for the CAISO to designate load as that non-spinning reserve, that if it's load, that can be curtailed within 10 minutes. So we don't normally do that. But the reason why that's important for the 14th and 15th is we were using our contingency reserves for just trying to meet sort of the various issues on the system. So again, I think most people are thinking of contingency reserves as meeting sort of the single largest contingency, and that could be, Diablo Canyon or the PDCI line. And yes, that's entirely true, but we can also use our contingency reserves if, other things are happening on the system. And, a lot was happening on the 14th and 15th. So, as we went through operations and those contingency reserves were actually being used and depleted on those days, what occurred was that we weren't able to find more generation to replace the reserves that we already started using. So as the sequence of events goes through, we took the extraordinary step of actually asking the investor-owned utilities to designate load as a stand-in for that 10-minute responsive non-spin reserve. So, that helped us kind of go back and meet that 6% reserve requirement, but things still were deteriorating on both days. So in fact, even with that kind of, stopgap measure, we still collectively fell below the 6% reserve requirement, and we already knew, because we had designated load as non-spin, that there wasn't any more generation around to designate as additional contingency reserve. So that's what kind of, that is what initiated the controlled load shed. so again, I hope that answers the question. It's a kind of a long answer, but if folks go back to page 30 and kind of read through that background, I think we try to put that in there to provide some context so that as you read through the sequence of events, you'll understand that when the load was designated as non-spin, it was because there was nothing else there. That helped us, get back to meet that 6% requirement. But then the controlled load shed was really when we fell below that 6% and there wasn't anything else to replace it with.
Thanks, Delphine. This next question is probably geared towards the ISO and maybe the CEC. So the report states non-CPUC jurisdictional entities that were contacted prior to the issuance of this report that they did not shed load on either day, page 41. Are the non-CPUC jurisdictional entities serving load within the CAISO balancing authority area, or was this regarding other balancing authorities in the state but not within the CAISO? If these non-CPUC jurisdictional entities are within the CAISO balancing authority, were they given instruction to shed load?
Yeah, maybe I'll start this one off, and I can't remember if it was CC or PC that may want to pick this up. So the reference to non-CPUC jurisdictional, they are within the CAISO BAA. We didn't do any digging into outside of the BA, and we do want to understand if there are entities that didn't respond, why they didn't respond. And that's something that we hope to have more time to dig into and then include that in the final report. And that is within the scope of the next steps. So I didn't know if CC and PC had anything to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely, Delphine. Thank you. Just kind of want to clarify that the non-jurisdictional would be the publicly owned utilities, including municipal utilities, cooperatives, water management agencies, and other entities. So at the time of the report, we were kind of cramming to get all the details, but just as a review of actual August 2020 hourly data from the POUs, which CEC has information. So the POUs loads, first of all, were kind of in the vicinity of the audit forecast. So there was that. And in response to the stage 3, public utilities also have an obligation to shed load based on their proportionate share of the instructed system load when requested by CAISO. And among the largest, Anaheim, Pasadena, Riverside, and Alameda all implemented rotating outages on August 14th. Anaheim and Pasadena were able to limit outages to 15 minutes per customers. So utilities may also curtail other load, such as municipal water facilities, to reduce the need for rotating outages. So we are still digging into it, but there is preliminary indication that they did. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Moving on to our next question. Will the report compare August with conditions over Labor Day? Delphine, do you want to take this one?
That is a good point. I'll maybe speak for myself. I was not thinking it would go that far. I think to the extent that, we had sort of an easy comparison we try to put in there, but I don't think the focus of the report really was to dig into the conditions over Labor Day. At least from my perspective, though, I haven't had time to talk to the PC or the CC about this, so I don't know if they had any different views, or this is something we want to go back and think about. But I just think, considering the time and resources it took to get out the preliminary, just to mostly focus on 2 days, though though we did have some verbiage in there about what happened sort of the following week all the way through the 19th. That was already a very, very heavy lift. So maybe I'll turn it over to PC and CC to see if they wanted to say a few words about that.
Yeah, this, go ahead, Pete.
Well, I guess I would say that to the extent that anything would have changed between August and September that would be worth comparing, it wouldn't really be in the planning space. It would be in the market space. I really defer to CAISO on that. I mean, if there some of the changes that were implemented, if there's insights that can be gained from how another heat storm a month later, how those changes changed what results came from those changes, maybe that would be great. But if that's a lot of data and a lot more work, we still actually have a pretty good list of things that we need to do for the final report as it is. So
Yeah, from the CEC's perspective, I think it's the same thing. I think focusing on the 14th and 15th and completing the rest of the next steps that we noted would be our first kind of priority. But to the extent that there are lessons that are gleaned that we could, at a high level, put in, we will accept, especially we are conducting the weather analysis. To the extent that we could glean some insights, we could probably provide that in that, and then some of the actions that were taken during the Labor Day weekend to mitigate the high load we were seeing in the day-ahead forecast were very similar to what the actions were on the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and to the extent that they are meaningful, we could comment on that.
Great, thank you. Good point.
Okay, moving to the next question, Guillermo or Delphine, this is more geared towards either of you. The report on page 51 states, of this total, imports required to provide energy to CAISO under RA contracts collectively bid in approximately 330 megawatts less than their shown August RA values. Does the CAISO have information on why the 330 megawatts did not submit the required bids to meet their RA must-offer obligation?
I don't know, Guillermo, if you wanted to take a crack at that first. Yes, I think that's something that we're looking into. I think the focus on it on the preliminary report was mostly to figure out how bids were impacted. So I think there we were more focused on trying to understand resources that did bid and kind of didn't get through. And the big takeaway on the import side was specifically more in the Northwest where they were impacted by congestion. So I think that's a good point in trying to understand, why there were resources that, just didn't bid. And so I think we'll be digging into that issue as well for the final.
Thanks, Delphine. Another one maybe for you. Please explain the different credited numbers attributed to the CPUC.
Yes. Okay. So yes, this has been a popular question. So we'll take a little time to dig into this. So if folks can look on page 94, it has a sort of a longer. I know the report tried to be really short and punchy in the beginning, and I think folks may feel like maybe it was a little bit too short and they couldn't put all the puzzle pieces together. So I'll just note on page 94. There's a paragraph that provides a slightly more robust description, more specifically this question again for the PUC side of the credits. So the CPUC jurisdictional LSC August 2020 credits were, the total is actually 1632, and that represents about 3.5% of the total PUC jurisdictional obligation. And the way that breaks down is that of that 1632, there's about 150 megawatts that, from what we understand, would be just credited behind the meter resources. But if you put that aside, the remainder of that, the 1482, is a collective credit between the investor-owned utility demand response programs. And that in itself is split between the reliability demand response, the emergency demand response that needs a warning or higher trigger from the CAISO side, as well as the proxy demand response, which are the economic demand response. So the graphic in the report where it shows the 1482 line, all that is trying to say is of the total credit, which is 1482 for demand response, Again, we don't have actual, settlement quality meter data for demand response at this point, but luckily the IOUs were able to work with us and provide their preliminary assessment of what the reliability demand response was for those hours of our assessment. And then we also have in that graph, we added to that the economic demand response, the PDR. But again, that's not actual response, that's just more the CAISO dispatch. So the idea is that that's just sort of setting it up for folks to see. But again, for the final, what we really want to do is try to have a more robust analysis where we are looking at bidding, we're looking at, what CAISO dispatched out, and then what the actual response is when we actually get the settlement quality meter data back to us. So unfortunately, we wanted to provide, some discussion of demand response because we provided, quite a bit of discussion on the supply side. So we felt that we needed that treatment on both sides. But unfortunately, for the demand responses where we didn't have all of the settlement data. So again, preliminary report. We understand that it's not the full picture or the full story. So that's some of the things that we're trying to get to for the final report is to show all of that information, but at minimum, what we try to do is separate it so that we have the credit discussion on one side for the IOU-DR, which again, I think sometimes the missing puzzle piece was the 150 megawatts of behind-the-meter resources that were also credited. That gets you to the 1632. And then on the other side, there are non-IOU economic demand response, and that was provided on a separate graph on their own. And again, no actual load drop information based on settlement data. That is just the CAISO dispatch out. And again, we'll try to produce a more robust analysis for the final report, looking at bidding, CAISO dispatch, and then, closing the loop on that, which is the actual load drop. So we've gotten many questions about that. I apologize if that confused people in terms of the various crediting numbers. And of course, as I mentioned on the next steps in the prior slide, is we also want to dig into the non-CPUC jurisdictional because there's crediting there, and it's not as explicit as the PUC of what was credited. So that's another research item that we'll need to dig into. And that one is sort of, whereas I think a lot of what this preliminary report was data intensive, I think the next round is going to be more resource intensive because there we'll probably be, reaching out to folks and trying to, understand what those things are because they weren't in the CAISO system, at least not on the RA supply plans. So hopefully that clears it up for folks.
Well, and I guess this is Pete. I guess I would just add that the big delta there that on the during public comment at the legislative hearing on Monday, Representative Klika pointed out that she believed that difference is largely due to the credit not being reflected at the meter for behind the meter resource, and so this may very well be that the credits may include avoided line losses, avoided need for planning reserve margin for a resource that drops load and modifies load, but it's shining a light on something that we need to work through if that's indeed the delta.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, for that. Sorry, I left that one out, but you're absolutely right. At least from the CAISO system, from what we can see, it definitely does include the planning reserve margin. So that is the 1482 itself is a grossed up number. CAISO doesn't see the other points that you made, but yes, we should probably talk about that in the final. So yes, that would help to close the gap there.
Okay, quick time check. We're at 4:23 p.m., so we probably have time for a couple more questions. So I'll start with one, looks like maybe geared more towards the PUC. It's in reference to page 65 of the report, so I'll read a brief excerpt from that page. It says, bring additional resources online, the CPUC and CEC, to expedite the regulatory and procurement processes to develop additional resources that can be online by 2021, including coordination with non-CPUC jurisdictional entities. This will most likely focus on demand-side resources such as demand response and, as possible, the acceleration of online dates of resources under development but not scheduled to be online by summer of 2021. This can complement the resources that are already under construction. The question is, have the joint agencies performed any loss of load expectation studies for 2021 to ascertain the need for resources incremental to the identified procurement mandated by the CPUC within the Integrated Resource Plan? And if so, how many megawatts of capacity have been identified as the need?
So short answer is no. At this point, we've not conducted a loss of load expectation study for 2021. We have committed to, President Batcher has committed to an expedited procurement OIR, and we are currently, scoping out that OIR. It's unclear to me whether, the approach taken to determine how many additional resources are needed by 2021 would be modeling loss of load expectation effort, or perhaps more of a net short analysis based on the new and existing resources that we know or we anticipate coming online by next summer, compared with the demand forecast we saw during the heat storm. So it's unclear exactly how we will approach that. I don't want to get ahead of that OIR, but no, we haven't done that work yet and determined what the megawatt target would be as of now.
Yeah, to just add to Pete's, I don't think there's much to add from the CEC side, except for noting that we will be working with CPUC and other kind of balancing authorities to develop a summer assessment for 2021, which we expect to be completed by April timeframe next year, to then help support CPUC's decisions as they plan for the summer. And at the current level, we are still scoping out what exactly a summer assessment will look like, and would love to hear thoughts on that as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, and just I think these will be our last questions. It's just a follow-up to the one I just asked. How do the joint agencies anticipate this procurement will be coordinated with non-CPUC jurisdictional entities? And is the procurement simply an acceleration of the already authorized mandated IRP procurement, or is this in addition to that procurement?
So those sound like two different directions. The second one is still tied to PUC jurisdictionals, because that's the IRP is authorized procurement. So I can field that, and then maybe the CEC or CAISO can take a crack at the non-jurisdictionals. As far as the acceleration of already authorized or additional, I think, for 2021, either would work. I would expect that if any of those resources that are scheduled and contracted to come online at this point in 2022 or 2023 to meet those tranches of the IRP mandated procurement could be brought forward. That would be, one way, but of course that's robbing Peter to pay Paul, so we therefore, in turn need to backfill that procurement in the future years if those resources were being used to fill up any additional procurement need that was identified in this expedited OIR.
Yeah, just specifically on the non-jurisdictional, I think one of the discussions we are beginning to have within the joint agencies is to develop a forum this fall to have a dialogue on what the current procurement status is and what do we see some of the needs are, and how do we ensure supports to both non-jurisdictional LSCs, but also local governments on how best to procure the steel in the ground. Another thing that Pete alluded to, and as a part of this question really, in the recommendations, is really also trying to expand the demand-side programs. A part of it is analytical to understand the opportunity, and a part of it is to figure out programmatically how do we expand existing programs, and that's something that CEC and CPUC, with support from CAISO, will be looking into. In addition to this, CEC is putting together a workshop on November 19th to look at existing jurisdictional fleet. So we have about 29,000 megawatts of capacity from the jurisdictional power plants under CEC, and we are having the workshop to really understand if there's any opportunity to expand or enhance the capacity by implementing some efficiency measures, and that's something that we are looking into, and we would really encourage our participation into that workshop.
Thanks, Pete and Siva. So we have run out of time to address more questions. Our call ends at 4:30, but I do want to hand it over to Delphine for some closing remarks. So Delphine, I will hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Isabella. I do want to thank Pete Scala and Siva Gunda for their time here, and certainly to all the stakeholders for doing a great job submitting comments. We were a little afraid that we might get on here and there'd be crickets, but there's a robust set of questions. There's even more questions, and we appreciate that. And we'll take some time to review those and see what we, would fit into the final report. And thank you all to the CAISO team and Victor for helping out today. I do want to turn it over maybe to PUC first and CEC to see if they have any closing remarks.
None for me. It's been a pleasure, a lot of good questions, and happy to stay engaged.
Yeah, thank you, CAISO team and Delphine and Mark for having us to support this meeting. And I think the only thing I would like to just reiterate is what the principals have noted as a general spirit of the work that we've done is, that the joint agencies understand we own the issue, and I think there's an opportunity to really rethink what have gone down and address them and continue to improve on our planning processes to ensure that the state has clean, reliable, and affordable electricity. And important, I think, to quote Elliot, the new CEO for CAISO, we do want to focus on reliable decarbonization of the state and ensuring reliability. So thank you.
Thank you, Siva. I will make one friendly amendment, which is the CAISO is not an agency. But we are happy to be working with our agency friends in Denver.
It's just unfortunate because saying joint agencies is so much easier than saying joint entities.
And CAISO.
Thank you.
Understood. As shorthand, maybe we need to have some cool acronym like the triple C's. But appreciate your time and to the CAISO team. Isabella, we'll turn it back to you before this call devolves.
Thanks, Delphine. Just so as some next steps, we will continue our analyses, taking into consideration the questions that were submitted, and then aim to produce a final report towards the end of this year. But again, if you have any questions, please send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. It is here on the slide that is being shown. But other than that, I just want to thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.
That concludes our event. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.